Okay, let's jump in because we have a big topic as we have with our other sessions, and just 45 minutes to give you an intro to sustainability standards and frameworks. I'm really excited. We have a true expert here, Karina Hilton Spiegel, to walk us through this today. Before we jump in, I'll just do some introduction. So I am Katie Cross. I am the co-founder of ClimateCAP, and I manage sustainability programs here at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. We are excited to continue day 2 of our Climate Catalyst programming, and I think that you'll find this is an essential topic for anyone who wants to have a conversation about climate impacts, because if you can't measure and manage those impacts, then you can't have good conversations about finance and strategy as well. So we're going to jump into our topic in just a minute. First, I'm sure at this point, any of you participating have had an intro to ClimateCAP. If you haven't already joined our mailing list, I hope you do, because we have a lot of programming aimed at MBA students. I do want to highlight before we get started that we are supported by 54 partner schools. So we have educators across these partner schools working together to share best practices, develop new teaching resources, and collaborate on events, all with the intention of educating more MBAs about climate impacts and their implications for business risk and opportunity. So we are thankful to all of our partner schools. If you are an MBA and you don't see your school listed here, we would be happy to talk with you and/or the faculty and staff at your school. So put in a good word for us, and let's have a conversation about that. You can reach out to us at climatecap@duke.edu if you'd like to have a conversation about your school joining our network. Big thank you to our sponsors, including Environ, who you will hear from today. And with that, I want to jump in. You will have Karina's bio on our Catalyst website, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I really want to thank Karina, a Duke alum here, for being here today, and I hope that you'll gain a lot of insights. We will have questions at the end, so we'll let Karina go through her slides. Then I'll moderate questions, so if you can use the Q&A button as we go along, I'll take a look at those as Karina shares her talk. Thank you. Welcome, Karina. I'll let you share.
Thank you, Katie. Just get in here and share my slides. Assume you're able to see that. Yep. Yes. Okay. All right. So welcome everybody to the Sustainability Standards and Frameworks Primer. I'm just going to keep this intro brief because you will have it in the bio, but I've been in the world of sustainability for over 15 years now, senior sustainability consultant with Environ. I'm also a mom of 3, so I include my kids there, and originally from the Netherlands, but I live in Miami Beach now. So welcome everyone from all over the world, I hear. Environ, we do a lot of things. We work on energy procurement, engineering, and sustainability services, which is where I work, and we touch on greenhouse gas emissions accounting, sustainability disclosures, and climate risk. So those are those bulleted here because these are the topics we'll be discussing today. So here's our session agenda, our roadmap. We'll be leading with sustainability reporting standards and frameworks. We'll get into that greenhouse gas emissions accounting, a quick intro to climate risk assessments, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions in the chat. So let's dive into this first section, sustainability and standards and frameworks. And there's a lot of material here, so just doing my best to get you guys all the insight you need to get started here. So before we go into these specific standards, we really need to see why we need to use them. And that's really because the world of sustainability information is really complicated. As you can see here, there's companies publish sustainability reports, and then there's a whole host of stakeholders who review those. So as you can see, from the financial standpoint, there's a lot of intermediaries before you get to the end user, which would be an investor. So you've got asset managers, index providers, rating agencies, and they all kind of collect, interpret, and some score this information before it reaches that final investor. Of course, you have other stakeholders who are interested in the information, and that's like NGOs, regulators, communities, and they may use information that's being given from the intermediaries, which came from that company's disclosure, or they may go directly to the source. And just so you know here, really quick, I've got a term ESG on the slide, and that stands for environmental, social, and governance. And that's really an umbrella term used for these non-financial topics. So with so many players interpreting these reports, it's really important to have these shared standard disclosures so that you know that the information can be comparable, it's trustworthy, and this is the same as in like financial reporting. You use GAAP in the US. So these standards unify disclosures for comparable, high quality reporting, and they really serve as the foundation. So why do companies go through the trouble of reporting on sustainability? Of course, a major reason is there's stakeholders requiring it, but there's also internal benefits. The discipline that reporting provides helps to set the company's vision and strategy, actually measure performance with real data, manage its risks and motivate employees. And then externally, it can build reputation and trust, help attract capital, which of course is why investors are asking for the information, can keep stakeholders engaged, and keeps the company on the right side of providing information for regulatory purposes. So what actually goes into sustainability reporting? And really the trick is knowing your audience here. So briefly, there's 3 boxes here. This innermost box is really financial statements. It's the dollar and cents numbers that go into traditional accounting standard setters, right? Then we have the middle box, which is the sustainability risks and opportunities that a company faces, and that could affect a company's financially. This is the information that investors care about. And then that outermost box, which is the widest view, and it's basically all of a company's impacts on people, the environment, and the economy. And this is aimed at every type of stakeholder. So it's this multi-stakeholder view. And an important nuance here is that these topics, they're not fixed. There's no fixed boundary. So a topic can start in that broadest box and then move to become a financially material issue over time. So it's dynamic. And then another important term for this field to know about is materiality, and you'd hear it a lot. And it simply means figuring out what matters most to report on. So you've got these 2 views. On the top, you have this impact materiality, which is an inside-out view, basically, how an organization affects the environment and the people. And then this inside-out view on the bottom, which is basically looking at how a company is being affected by sustainability issues, how it affects its own finance. So already you've seen these standards on the last few slides, GRI and IFRS sustainability, and I will go into what they mean, but basically GRI is got that impact lens, and the IFRS has more of the financial sustainability lens. And then if you look at both together, it's a double materiality perspective, which we'll come back to shortly. So again, these names, I'm going to get into each of these momentarily, but these are the big 3 kind of standard setters to know about at the moment. GRI is the Global Reporting Initiatives, again, for impact reporting. IFRS, Sustainability Disclosure Standards from the ISSB, they're on the right. And that's investor focused from a financial view. And then we have the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS, which comes from Europe's mandatory sustainability reporting disclosures. And then you'll see this term interoperability on the bottom of your slide. And it basically means that these standard setters and organizations are working closely together to make sure that these standards are interoperable and they reduce duplicative reporting if you're reporting to one or the other. And they're really complementary to each other. And so we'll take a look at these individually on the next few slides. So we've got the GRI. And so this is an independent nonprofit founded almost 30 years ago, and it's headquartered in the Netherlands, where I'm originally from. Back then, so 30 years ago, companies were just starting to talk about sustainability, but had no common language. So comparing one company to another was, nearly impossible. So the GRI basically created that shared language. And as you can see on the right, I'm not going to read it all, but it caught on. So roughly 9 in 10 reporting companies use the GRI. GRI reporters make up the majority of the global market value, and well over 100 countries reference GRI in their policies. And so the purpose of the GRI standards is to enable organizations to publicly disclose its most significant impacts on the economy, environment, and people, including impacts on human rights. And of course, how it manages these in a consistent, credible way. And so a few features to mention, these are modular, interconnected pieces that you can combine as needed, and you'll see that on the next slide. They're built through a multi-stakeholder process, which you could also be a part of when these standards are updated. They can be used by any organization of any size and anywhere. And they center on that idea of materiality, identify your impacts, and report on the topics that matter most. And then here's how that modular system is put together. So you have these 3 series of standards. On the left, you have your universal standards. So that's GRI 1, 2, and 3, and they cover the principles for using the standards, the general disclosures about your organization, and how to determine those material topics. And then in the middle, you have these sector standards, which are tailored to your industry, from flagging topics that are likely material to your industry, if you're oil and gas, for example, or agriculture. And then on the right, you have your topic standards. So these are the ones you pull from if you deem a topic material, so like waste or health and safety, climate, for example. And so you start with that universal standards, you layer on your sectors, and then add the specific topics that are material to you. And then another thing, when you look at a GRI report, when you read one, you want to see if it's being reported in accordance with the standards, which means it's fully complying with the standards, or it's in reference to, meaning partial alignment. Okay, so now that second big player is the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, and this is set by a body called the ISSB, which I mentioned earlier. It's the International Sustainability Standards Board, and sometimes these standards are informally also called the ISSB standards. So either the IFRS Sustainability Standards or the ISSB standards, they're one and the same. And so for years, there's been this alphabet soup of voluntary frameworks that you see at the top of this triangle. And then these, I won't call them all out, but all these frameworks, the CDSB, the TCFD, the SASB, they were consolidated through the ISSB in response to demand from investors and companies and international policymakers for this decision-useful, comparable sustainability information, an end to that alphabet soup, overlapping voluntary initiatives, and for a more efficient global reporting landscape. So the first 2 standards that were issued by the ISSB were issued in June 2023, so it's quite new. It's the IFRS S1 and S2. S1 is the general one. It covers any sustainability topic that could reasonably be considered to affect a company's finances. Again, that effect to a company, or its cash flows, its access to funding, and this is over the long and short and medium term. Then if you go to S2, this is specific to climate and with more specific details related to that. They both share the same DNA, They focus on what's financially material to investors. They fold in the TCFD recommendations, which we'll look at on the next slide. And they combine this broad cross-industry disclosures with industry-specific ones. So think of S1 as more general framework and S2 with a deep dive into climate. So both of these standards are organized around these 4 core content areas that build on the TCFD recommendations that I mentioned earlier. It's structure. You have governance, so who oversees the risks and opportunities. You have strategy, what's the company's plan for managing them. And then you have risk management. How does it identify, prioritize, and manage those risks or monitor the risks? And then you have metrics and targets. How does it measure its performance? And then we mentioned, what's going on in Europe. Europe has the ESRS, and here's, how that fits in. You have, we've seen that sustainability reporting has evolved from that voluntary GRI reporting, that started more than 30 years ago, to countries referencing GRI and their rules, to the investor-focused IFRS sustainability standards, and now Europe combining kind of both views, of materiality, impact, and that financial view into mandatory reporting. So you have the ESRS, which is required under an EU law called the CSRD. There's still an alphabet soup out there, which means Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And they use that double materiality lens that I mentioned before. So companies have to report both on their impacts as well as their risks and opportunities. And it's written by this organization called EFRAG. And it can cover, topics from climate to water to labor practices. And you can look all this up if you Google the ESRS to see what topics are included. I know we're talking about Europe here, but it will likely reach non-EU companies that do business above a certain revenue threshold, and those will eventually need to report likely in 2029. Of course, this is evolving and this might change, so you can keep an eye on that online. All right, so that was quickly the standards and frameworks. We'll go into an overview of GHG emissions accounting, but before we do, one more quick look at the standards. So we just talked about GRI and IFRS, and they have their climate standards. On the left, we have the GRI 102 climate standard, which again is impact focused, how companies affect people, the economy, and the environment. On the climate side, it's broad, it's covering transition, adaptation planning, emissions, reductions targets, removals, and this is all across the value chain, which is another important term. And really, it's everything involved in your supply chain, from delivering your products or services to what happens after you deliver them to your customers and its end of life stage. And then on the right here, we have the IFRS S2. Again, that's the climate side. From an investor perspective, it's a lens that is financial risks and opportunities and how climate could affect a company's own performance through that lens of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. So both of these standards require emissions reporting. So let's get into that. And so we'll do a quick science primer really quickly. The greenhouse gas effect is that natural process where certain gases in the atmosphere let in sunlight, but they trap the heat that radiates back, kind of like, a blanket on Earth. This, of course, is important to keep our climate, regulated. And then, of course, what are these greenhouse gases? We have 7 major ones that we track. We've got the carbon dioxide or CO2. This is the most well-known probably amongst it. Then we have methane, nitrous oxide, and then several other industrial gases with really long names here, which I won't read out. So the key here is that not each and every one of these gases is equally powerful. Each one traps a different amount of heat, and we call that the global warming potential, or GWP. So think of it as kind of a potency score. So methane, for example, is far more potent for, over its lifetime than carbon dioxide. So how do you add up all 7 of these gases with different types of potencies so you can convert them into what's called carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e? So the easiest analogy here is currency. So you can imagine you have dollars, euros, and yens, but you can't add them up until you convert them into one of those currencies. So CO2e does the same thing for emissions. We take each gas, we multiply it by its global warming potential, what we saw on the last slide, and then it expresses it as the CO2 that would cause the same level of warming. So the result is this standardized figure that you usually see reported in metric tons of CO2e. And that's a number that you'll see in those sustainability disclosures that use those standards that we were discussing earlier. And then we can ground this in some, data, real data. This is from the EPA. And we can see where the big buckets of where these emissions are coming from. We have transportation, we have electric power, we've got industry, we've got buildings, we've got agriculture, and all those subcomponents. You'll see that there's 2 pie charts here. The one on the left assigns all of the emissions to electric power sector, versus the one on the right spreads that electricity amongst those industries that are using it. So amongst the buildings and industrial sectors and agriculture. So this is basically amongst the end use of those emissions, which is a term that we'll get into next, kind of the indirect use. So who owns an emission, the producer or the user, is a term, right, that we'll be getting back to as we think about emission scopes shortly. So before we get into that, we just, the same as with the standards for sustainability reporting, there are rule books and standards for measuring your emissions. And the globally known one is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, or GHG Protocol. And that is basically a manual on how to calculate your emissions. It's organized into core standards. You've got the corporate standard, which is foundational. And then there are dedicated standards to Scope 3, which we'll discuss in a moment. But it is for value chain emissions. You've got your product and project protocol. And then these sit on additional guidance for cities and agriculture, land, and etc. So to show you the importance of this GHG protocol, you can see the statistics from 2023 that 97% of the S&P 500 companies that disclosed emissions did so using this protocol. So as we mentioned before, when nearly everyone uses the same method, it makes those numbers comparable, and that's what makes data useful. So this grew out of a 2-decade partnership between the World Resources Institute, or WRI, which is a research nonprofit, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is a CEO-led coalition to create internationally acceptable GHG accounting standards and to promote their adoption. So for the GHG protocol, the greenhouse gas emissions of a company are sorted into these 3 different buckets: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So for Scope 1, these are a company's direct emissions, and that's what's kind of highlighted here in this box. So they come from sources that the company itself owns or controls. So basically, if a company is burning that fuel directly. So we can think of natural gas burned by a company's own boilers, or gasoline used in its own fleet. Emissions that leak from its own industrial equipment processes. So to think about, if a company owns it, that's likely, and is using it from its own operations, it's likely Scope 1. So if you ran a delivery business, for example, your fuel and your trucks, you own, those would be Scope 1. They tend to be the most visible and most most directly controllable emissions because, you can act and change the way that you're using or change your equipment or change your operations. So the next is scope 2, and these are indirect emissions from the energy that a company buys. So most commonly, this is electricity that you purchase from the grid, or it's your purchased heat and steam. So the nuance here is that the company doesn't burn anything itself when it turns on the light, right? You purchase it from a power plant, so the power plant is. And that's why it's indirect, but the company created the demand for that power. So those emissions get counted as under their scope 2. And the reason that this is the case is because you have different levers to pull for when you're trying to make changes there. You can't redesign a power plant because you don't own the power plant, but you could sign contracts for renewable energy. You could use less energy. You can install your own solar power. So the example here is going back to that delivery business, right? The electricity, lighting, and heating for your warehouses, those would be considered scope 2. So then scope 3, which is a big one, and we mentioned it's within your value chain, it's your indirect emissions from the sources that the company doesn't own, right? But they happen up and down your value chain. So this splits into upstream and downstream. So upstream is everything from going into making the product, the emissions from your suppliers, from your purchased materials, from business travel, from commuting. And then downstream is everything after the product leaves, from customers using it and disposing of it. So for our delivery business, we can think of scope 3 including the manufacturing of the trucks that you purchase, employee commuting, any waste sent to landfill. And it's the hardest bucket to measure because all that information sits outside of your company's control. And it requires a lot of engagement with your stakeholders to get this information, or otherwise a lot of assumptions may need to be made. So let's get into how we actually convert these activities into emissions. And basically, there's this core formula. You have your activity data and you multiply it by an emissions factor, and that equals your emissions. So activity data is just something that your business has done expressed in its natural unit. So you could have kilowatt hours of electricity used, therms of natural gas burned, gallons of gasoline, miles flown, and it can also even be a dollar amount here. And then your emissions factor is a conversion rate. So it's how much CO2e is released per unit of that activity that we just mentioned. So you multiply those two, and then you get your emissions, usually in metric tons of CO2 equivalent that we discussed earlier. So these emissions factors are usually published in databases that are maintained by trusted bodies like the International Energy Agency, you've got the US EPA, you've got the UK DEFRA. But it's important to look at what sources have been used and to choose accordingly. So we'll look at this formula. I'm not going to go into all of these, but we can look at the top one. So let's take electricity. A facility used 150,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, which is the activity data. Then we can go to the EPA, which has an emissions factor for that grid of wherever that business is located or that electricity came from. And it comes to 28.8 metric tons of CO2e. And then you could continue on that and add all of those emissions up together, and then you would have your emissions for the company. So remember, scope 3 is usually the biggest bucket. So here's some information on that. So across most sectors, scope 3 is the majority of a company's footprint. In roughly 70% of the sectors, it's more than half of combined scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And in 47%, it's 80% or more. So strategically, what that means is that if a company reduces its own emissions, and we talked about scope 1 and 2, it may, in a lot of these cases, not reduce its entire footprint that much. So real progress, as I mentioned, needs to be taken by working through your with your stakeholders, your suppliers, and perhaps rethinking certain products. Again, we mentioned this, the catch here is that scope 3 is hard to measure. The data doesn't belong to you, so there may be a lot of estimations. So just to tie this all together, here's an example. This is Ford's 2025 Integrated Sustainability and Financial Report. As you can see here, scope 1, I mean, it has meaningful emissions. I'm highlighting them, like 870,000 metric tons from its plants, right? And then scope 2 is the electricity, and it's like 2 million metric tons. But this scope 3, that's the kicker, right? 354 million metric tons. Most of it's from people using their cars. So, just something to consider when you're looking at these reports. Are they reporting on all of their emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3? Are they giving you multiple years? Is there a trend so you can, look and understand their reporting? Another thing, we're not going to read this, is just to look at their assumptions, look at their methodology, make sure to review what standards they've used, and if they're using credible methodologies. Because even with these standards and frameworks, companies may be making some adjustments, and they should be transparent with that. All right, so we've spent some time, most of the time, on the sustainability standards and frameworks, and then the emissions accounting. So we've got a little bit of time for an introduction to climate risk assessment. And so I'll get right in it in the interest of time and to allow for Q&A. So again, let's set the stage with this definition. So weather, right, is the short-term state of the atmosphere, and climate is long-term averages over decades. So climate-related risks are the risks from the effects of climate change and what that's having on Earth systems. So we sort these into these two families. You've got physical risks, which are direct effects of a changing climate, and they come in acute form, these two forms: acute, which is a sudden event like a flood or a storm, and chronic, which is this gradual shift from a rising sea level, for example, or changing in temperatures. So we've got transition risks come from the shift from a low carbon economy. So these are grouped into like policy and regulatory, technology, market, and reputational. And then we've got another term here, which is talking about transition channels, which are basically the pathways that climate risks have to reach financial institutions and the economy. So you've got your microeconomic channels, which affect the banks and lenders and your customers, their customers, and then the macroeconomic channels, which basically affects an entire region or a country's financial stability. So let's dive into these. We'll look here first at transition risks. So again, these are come from moving from a low carbon economy, and there are basically 4 types. That policy and regulatory risk. Again, this is about new rules, things like carbon tax, cap and trade, energy efficiency. We've got technology risk. This is when kind of a newer, cleaner technology comes and displaces your product. This can also raise your cost and make what you sell less valuable. And then there's market risk, which is about a shifting demand. So customers preferring more sustainable products, for example, or it can steer investor choices. And then reputational risk, which is the hit a company takes if it's seen as unable to transition to a lower carbon economy or is too invested in fossil fuel. And this can damage, the brand and shake investor confidence here. So basically the through line here is that it's not about the weather itself, it's about how the response to climate change reshapes that business landscape. And so now the other family of physical risks, you've got the direct effects of climate change, And so there's acute risks, those immediate short-term risks from extreme weather, flooding, storms, heat waves, droughts, for example. And then you've got your chronic risks, which are those slow burn ones from sea level rise, shifting rainfall patterns, steady temperature rise. And these play out over years and carry implications for agriculture, food security, and etc. So what exactly is a climate risk assessment? And basically, it's the process of identifying and analyzing and evaluating the climate-related risks, both physical and the transition kind that we mentioned before, that could affect a business, its operation, and its value chain. So it's not only about risk, it's also about spotting those opportunities and strategic advantages that come with the transition. So in practice, companies use these assessments to do a few things, right? They map their risk across operations and the supply chain. They analyze how likely those climate events are and how much they'd cost. They use geospatial tools to pinpoint which locations are most exposed. And they run climate scenarios. And these are climate scenario analysis, which are kind of structured as a what-if exercise to prepare a range of possible futures. And then the overall objective is to help an organization prepare for and mitigate for any disruptions caused by these climate-related risks. And I'm leaving you with some tools, but you can, when you'll get the slides, you can review those, because I know we are at time for some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karina. We gave you a nearly impossible task to cover these topics in a short amount of time. So I appreciate you giving so much detail and thoughtful explanation. We definitely did have some questions about some clarifying questions. So maybe you can just switch back to your previous slide, because I was hoping that you would share if a student, besides these tools, if a student just wants to get up to speed on the basics, are there other things you would recommend, like a Coursera course or other ways for them to learn more about the fundamentals?
Well, yeah, we have Environ offers classes on these, so definitely reach out to us. But yes, there are, looking at, even going back and looking at the IFRS sustainability standards, the S2, you can read in there a little bit about the need for those climate risk assessments, and it has some information, so a lot on their website. You can also look at the GRI's website, and then we have these tools. So there's a lot of information out there, and there are courses that you can take with us or with other organizations for more information on that.
And, maybe some of our students on the call today are not going to work directly in sustainability reporting. So besides the sort of need to respond to regulatory compliance or investor requests, can you share any examples of how like business managers might use sustainability data in their business decision making?
Right. So I think most people have probably heard about enterprise risk management, and they're identifying all these business risks. Well, essentially, from that risk, a materiality assessment, we go back to the start, we're identifying risks and opportunities to a business and how a business impacts its environment. So this has to do with, keeping your license to operate, um, you know, identifying what these risks, these climate-related risks and opportunities are, but then how they translate to a business risk. So this is important for a business strategy. So ideally, this is not just a reporting exercise, it's helping to understand the business impact or how a business is being impacted. And you're going to be dealing with all your internal stakeholders. You're going to be dealing with your finance, your legal, your risk management team, if there is one, and then leadership, to make sure everyone's aware, and ideally the board is also being updated on this. So this is not just supposed to be an exercise in reporting, but it is a way and a framework of how to think about these risks and opportunities and these impacts to then translate this into a business lens with those other internal important stakeholders.
Great. And then a couple of folks have asked about sort of why report or what the consequences are of not reporting. Can you share just a snapshot of maybe the where the reporting is required and which of the reporting is required? I know it varies a lot, but the big trends.
Yeah. So, as far as regulatory, the US doesn't have a regulatory requirement to report. If you go onto the IFRS website, they have a jurisdictional site where you can see which countries have been making it either completely mandatory or incorporating components of the IFRS sustainability standards. And there's a whole list of countries. I mean, Australia is one. And then we have Europe, which has its own, which are basically based off of both of those other standards. And then, as I mentioned before, the GRI, even though it's a voluntary standard, there are countries and jurisdictions that have incorporated it into their policies that companies should be using certain of their standards. So, it's global. There's still a lot of voluntary reporting. I think we've seen even with European companies that are now having to use the EU standards for reporting. They're still alongside, because it's very dry and it's very prescriptive, are still issuing a sustainability report to tell the rest of their story. So, to explain the context around it. And that is, the GRI standards are very helpful for that too.
And the latest on the CSRD is which companies does it apply to? Not only European companies, but some that are operating, right, or have supply chains in Europe.
Yes, but there's been a delay in reporting. From what I read more recently, they may even be working on a separate set of standards for those that are not in the EU. So that's to be determined. And then from what I understand, it's in 2029 based on 2028, the fiscal year. But again, that could move. We'll have to keep an eye on that.
So for everyone listening, as you can tell, it's been a really dynamic space with a lot of changes, a lot of acronyms, a lot of regulatory frameworks changing. Many companies, my understanding is that many of them are reporting because the landscape is changing so much. They're tending to report to appease as many stakeholders as possible, so that they're not caught flat-footed without the data. And whether they have the operations in the jurisdictions or not, whether they're investors who are asking for this data. So there are many different stakeholders who are asking companies to disclose their sustainability data and information.
Yep.
Excellent. Here we see Karina's information. I'm going to share my slide as just our last minute here, after you all have a chance to see that. And just to remind you, thank you all for joining us here today. Clearly, there's so much more we could talk about. There's so many more questions we could ask Karina, but I think this is a really, really helpful introduction to some of the details. We've been talking a lot about the theory and the strategies behind managing climate risks, but really getting into the weeds of how you would do this is so important. So for those of you who are on the call right now, we hope that you will use the same link. We will close this session and restart. We hope you'll join us in 15 minutes for understanding energy and the global energy transition. And then we will have a panel on careers related to climate and energy this afternoon. So should be a great couple more sessions today. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to Karina and the whole Environ team for being here today.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.